focus looking at cross-border transactions has been on small firms. And so we've limited our data to those firms with more than $10,000 in annual sales on the eBay marketplace. And we call those sellers, those firms, technology-enabled small businesses. Because they are small, and because to grow their business, they rely on the internet, and they use the technology-based services that run on top of the internet. Our research has been about, and is still about, those firms' participation in international trade. And it's a research project that just keeps growing. We've almost analyzed our way around the world. And so now we know that Ukrainian technology-enabled small businesses, they serve customers in, on average, 35 different countries. And we can compare that to the 24 markets that French firms serve. Or the record we find in the UK, where UK businesses reach 39 different markets. We've noted that there is a large share of newcomers engaging in exporting in Chile. And more than 80% of those newcomers survive their first commercial year. That's about the same survival rate that we see in the US newcomers. We've also picked up on the fact that technology-enabled small businesses in South Africa and in Jordan, they have a similarly sized customer base, serving customers in, on average, 28 to 30 different markets. So those are a lot of numbers. Let me help you to make sense of these findings. Let me try and place them in the context of trade debate, in the context of what we know about traditional trade. We know that most traditional firms do not export. We heard that this morning. And it's constantly been shown across countries and across time. And it is true for Canada as well. And we heard that this morning. We heard that amongst the about 1 million small businesses in Canada that engage that operate in Canada, only about 41,000 export. But if we compare that to technology-enabled Canadian businesses, it looks very different. In 2013, 99.5% of those firms exported. We also know that traditional exporters reach just a small number of different destinations, of different markets. Research of 2010, published by the Government of Canada, tells us that Canadian exporters reach on average 2.5 different markets. Statistics Canada tells us that the majority of Canadian firms sell only to the US. Our data tell us that technology-enabled exporting Canadian firms, they reach on average 19 different markets. And 94% of them sell to both US and other countries. Only 5% sell only to the US market. Something else we know is that traditional export is dominated by a small number of very large firms. Industry Canada found that in 2011, the largest 1% of firms in Canada accounted for almost 60% of export. We've looked at the largest 3%, and of traditional Canadian exporters, they account for about 80% of export. Of the technology-enabled Canadian exports, they account for less than 36% of exports. And one more thing we know. We know that most export is made by long-established exporters. So profiling Canadian exporters between 1996 and 2009, Statistics Canada found that only around 4% of all exporters are new exporters. Among all the Canadian technology-enabled exporters, in 2013, newcomers made up 13% of the marketplace. So again, a lot of numbers, perhaps too many numbers for dinner. But if you were to take away one thing from this research, it is that our research makes clear that at the intersection of technology, trade looks very different. So at the intersection of technology, trade is also micro and small firms transacting directly with customers in a large number of countries worldwide. And this is the rise of the micro-multinational. This is Bernd L's business in Williams Lake. So he sells Cox model plane engine parts. 95% of his business is international. Last year he sold to 80 different countries, and amongst them were New Caledonia, Seychelles, and again Malta. It is also Farishta Sarifa, successfully selling exclusive designer gowns out of her home in London, Ontario. Also, she expects or estimates that 95% of her business is international. And that's the only way she can sustain a living of a niche product. Even if she lived in a bigger city, she wouldn't be able to sustain her business only through local sales. And for her, right now, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are her most interesting markets. So it's the rise of the micro-multinational. It's also the rise of the global consumer. And that's the Canadian consumer buying yarn from the Turkish firm Yarn Paradise, set up in Istanbul by Ferit Göksen and today employing 20 people. And again, they also estimate 98% being international sales of their business. That goes to Canadian consumers, but it also goes to consumers in the US, France, Haiti, Egypt, and Ecuador. We can calculate and estimate the economic benefits for consumers from these new trade patterns. We can calculate and estimate the growth and job creation benefits from this type of SME internationalization. It's more difficult to put a number on, and what I think is almost as important, to put a number on the social and political benefits. The changes to trade patterns that I've talked about, it is basically about bringing small businesses and consumers into the global trading system. And with that now happening in practice, we should also bring them into the trade policy system. And by doing so, I would suggest that we can change the globalization discourse, as it's sometimes heard outside of these walls, and we can counter some of the classical criticism of trade policy, namely that it benefits only the large corporations. And this is how I see it. Technology is blazing new trails. There is a new segment of traders, the micro-multinational. And the micro-multinational face unique issues when engaging in trade. And these are issues that can be part of trade policy regimes. So let me give you 4 examples. First, customs processes now need to adapt to a world where millions of small packages are being sent by hundreds of thousands of small businesses around the world. And that is a very different world to the one of containers with products from 1 or 2 companies shipped between well-established trade corridors. I believe we need to review trusted trader programs. The Canada's is called Partner in Protection. It's well known that SMEs aren't well integrated into these programs. Last month, the WCO, the World Customs Organization, held a global meeting discussing that concern and discussing solutions such as education and assisting SMEs. And of course, educating and assisting SMEs about trusted trade programs is very important. But I think that we need to more fundamentally rethink these programs and how they can secure and facilitate technology-enabled trade. How can customs risk assessment be informed by the new type of data points that are actually generated in a digital environment? Think about feedback ratings. Think about the performance measurements that online intermediaries provide. And how do we attribute correct risk scores to trade patterns that look like what we generally would define as high risk? Irregular shipments of a large number of small parcels to a large number of changing destinations. Second, postal policy has traditionally sat outside of trade debate, trade discussion. But today the postal system is being used to engage in trade. In particular, small businesses turn to postal over express delivery for cost reasons. So postal operators are ideally situated to become one of the enablers of technology-enabled trade. And that is good news. Because on the one hand, mail volumes are falling. The Conference Board of Canada warns that this seriously challenges and harms the growth of the postal system and the Canadian postal system, and they estimate that Canada Post might lose $1 billion by 2020. But on the other hand, technology is driving the rise of parcel shipments. And as technology-enabled trade grows, the global postal system will become more and more important for trade. So let's think about how trade policy could play a role in creating a more efficient multinational postal regime. Third, financial services policy. So if you think about it, what these technology-enabled firms or businesses do is actually engage in cross-border financial flows on a daily basis. So payments are key to technology-enabled trade. They create a link not only to global consumers, but also to firms in remote areas. And we heard this morning how accessing or entering into new domestic markets, new provinces, also boosts productivity. So take India. It has 28 states. Sellers on eBay reach on average 19 of those. And in fact, the Reserve Bank of India, it recognizes the power of digital payments. In 2012, it presented a payments system vision document. It's not that dissimilar from the 2011 report by the Canadian Task Force for the Payments System Review. And this report makes several suggestions for creating regulation that supports digital payments. And I would say that this is also a trade interest. And I think that Pat Meredith, who chaired this task force, she sums it up very nicely in her introduction to this report. She refers to digital payments as a passport to the world. And fourth, lastly, international regulatory cooperation in consumer laws is now also a trade interest. One experiment with it, which I thought was very interesting, it was to apply the so-called balls and bins statistical model to eBay trade and to traditional trade. This is a model by Armenter and Coren, and it predicts the number of export destinations per exporter, taking into account or data scarcity and by implying that there are no fixed costs to exporting, which there are, of course. And without going into more detail of this model, because I'm no economist, the we found that it better replicates technology-enabled trade than traditional trade. So we found that fixed costs are lower for online trade. And with that comes a certain degree of randomness in trade. Think about randomness in trade as the export destinations being determined by customer activity. So of course, the traders make significant investments and efforts into targeting certain markets, and actually sometimes in refraining from targeting certain markets. But there's also a very strong element of consumer activity, of the consumer finding the trader. And that's how Canadian firms find themselves serving consumers in 133 different countries. So it's potentially a borderless environment, but you still have differences in national laws that cause concerns to both consumers and firms. And so I think that we need to look for new forms of international regulatory cooperation. And one such idea is to apply non-national legal instruments. So the idea is of a law that lies on top of national laws. It's an alternative. It's a voluntary option for consumers and businesses when in cross-border situations. The EU is about to adopt this type of instrument in the area of consumer law. So why not, in the context of the forthcoming EU and Canada trade agreement, extend this instrument to also Canadian transactions? So customs, postal, payments, and consumers. So those are 4 matters. 4 areas that matter. 4 areas that could immediately, right now, be discussed in the context of trade policy through the prism of technology-enabled trade. And this is about taking action to address the unique issues that micro-multinationals face when trading, and they face them because of their characteristics. Small, less experienced, selling around the world to customers in many different countries and without local establishments in those countries. So it's about taking action, but it's also about thinking and talking about trade policy in a new way, using it to describe and point to opportunities. Because with these new trade patterns that I've described, we could actually be talking about trade agreements for people. It's the trade equivalent of Carl von Linné's system. Global system and global language, capturing the largest and the smallest and taking into account their characteristics. So I think I'm going to leave you with Carl von Linné. I was tempting to leave you with some numbers on the World Cup, because it was I stumbled upon some numbers, and actually 67% of the World Cup players are based elsewhere. They live and play in foreign countries. And during the World Cup right now, 10% of the players are foreign-based. So you have a Canadian playing in a Dutch company, in the Dutch team. So I was thinking, because if I understand correctly, neither Canada nor Sweden plays in the World Cup, and both countries have very few players playing in foreign markets, playing in foreign countries in the World Cup. And we heard today that exporting is also about the flow and picking up new ideas and innovation. And Carl von Linné, what did he do? He transcended cultures, he transcended borders. So perhaps with a little bit more of cross-border, we will both be participating in the 2018 World Cup.